I do executive coaching for women because I've had whistleblower complaints, I've had bullying complaints, I've had all these challenging situations. I just scraped through. I scraped through year 12. What's your vision? A lot of people don't have a vision. And the vision doesn't have to be for 5 years. It could be for the next 6 months. So that was very much a sliding doors moment. So instead of you can very much get feedback on yourself and how you are as a person in the presence of horses. And some leadership teams and some people need that feedback that maybe they're not getting otherwise. So this is where you need to find the people around you who are going to support you when you come up against those big things, and particularly in the workplace.
Today, we're excited to welcome Sam McIntyre, a former CIO with over 30 years of tech experience, including 15 years at top leadership roles. Sam has been a standout at renowned organisations such as Coles-Myer, DaimlerChrysler, Tesco, Woolworths Group, Simplot, L'Oreal, Bega Cheese, Suzanne, One Roof Women, Target, and now Tech Boosters. Her impact goes beyond the boardroom. Sam is also an executive coach passionate about empowering women in technology. She hosts the Lady Leadership podcast, where she shares insights from inspiring women leaders on career growth, leadership, and diversity. Join us as we explore Sam's incredible journey and a mission to help 100,000 women advance their tech careers. Alrighty. So Sam, thank you for joining me today.
Absolute pleasure.
I will admit I'm a little bit nervous having an accomplished podcaster on the show. So I feel like I'm going to have to level up today. We'll see how we go. Look, you've had a really broad and diverse career in technology. You've lived and worked overseas. You've launched businesses. You helped develop the next generation of tech talent. You've done a lot of work in diversity and inclusion as well. So it's an incredibly broad range of stuff for us to cover off today. So I'm pretty excited to unpack all that stuff with you. But let's start with the tech career.
Yes.
And I saw from your resume that it all kind of started back at Vic University.
It did. It did.
Applied science and computing.
Correct.
So what motivated you to go into computing in the 90s?
So I think, this is a good story to start with. What motivated me to go into tech in the 90s was that, believe it or not, you actually didn't need to get very high marks to get into tech back then. And so I actually wanted to be a travel agent.
Okay.
Believe it or not. And that was actually a university course, and I didn't get enough marks to get into that. And I was sitting down with my grandfather. Back then you had books that you would look through the courses, etc. And I was at my grandparents' place, and he had actually been in the war. He'd been in Papua New Guinea, and he'd sent messages over telephony there to the troops in other parts of Papua New Guinea across lines. So he said to me, why don't you have a look at computers? I think, and this is the statement, right? I think computers are going to be around for a while. Now, he'd come back from the war and was a furniture removalist. He was a truck driver. He drove a truck up and down the East Coast, owned his own truck, worked very hard. But yeah, that was a toss away line. And so I then looked up some of computer science courses and found myself at Victoria University.
There you go. What an incredible, insightful piece of advice.
Yeah, that's right. That 30 years since that point, I've had a career in tech. So yeah.
So did you fall in love with tech at that point?
Not then, no, definitely not. I think I hit that course, and a lot of people had studied previously in computer science type, in year 12, etc. I think in year 10 we'd done typing. So one of the good things I can do is actually touch type about pretty quick, because we'd learnt typing. And then when I was doing that course, I actually went back and redid another secretarial typing course. So it's been one thing, odd things in your career that make you effective. I can touch type. So,
Do you think they still teach type?
No, definitely not.
There's no way they do they?
No, but it's been so beneficial for me from a productivity perspective. It's crazy, right? So I just thought if I'm going to be using a computer for the rest of my foreseeable future, right? Wasn't thinking rest of my life then at the age of. So I was actually 17 as well when I was at university. So I'd actually started school really early. I was 17. I was just a bit too young. Didn't, went to uni. I just scraped through. I scraped through year 12, scraped through university. And it wasn't, for me, it was about connecting why we were studying something or doing something, how that related to the real world. And often I couldn't make that connection and I didn't understand. And so once I actually started working, then it just really made sense to me why we were actually doing something or what the purpose of it was.
Yeah, so, that makes sense. So when you left university, I think you went to Coal-Mire?
I went to Coles-Mire, yeah. So I actually had worked in Target stores on the weekend, casual. There was a notice on the board for Target saying Helpdesk operator at the time. I was like, okay, I've studied computers. My mum had actually said to me, oh, do you think you might be able to get something in the office at Target? And I was like, oh, yeah, another defining moment, right? So, so I actually moved to Geelong. They were based in Geelong. I grew up in the southeastern suburbs, so actually moved to Geelong, moved out of, home at 20, had a little flat down there and, worked on the help desk. So
there you go.
Yeah.
And you spent like 7 years, I think, with them.
Yes.
Did you move through a series of roles in that time?
Yeah.
What kind of transitions did you make?
Oh, pretty much every 12 months, 18 months. I'd say in my career, it's pretty much been 12 months, 18 months the whole time, right? So, and that would be, I'd get into a job, understand the job, do the job for a while, and then I'd be looking for what's the next opportunity or what's the next step. I never, when I looked back at, when I was on that help desk, all the executives actually sat on a higher floor, and anyone who worked at Target, knows what I'm talking about. It was that day when people were in suits, they had their little offices.
Yeah.
All the execs and the management were on a different floor. I never actually could see myself in a senior. I didn't have that vision back there. I wasn't like, oh, I want to do this job. It was about doing the job and this is what I say in coaching these days, doing the job that I was in well, and then building the skills for that next job. And so what is the next thing that I want to do? So I was always just thinking, what's the next opportunity or the opportunity after that? I was only ever thinking 2 jobs away.
And it sounds like, even how you described how you got into that role, you saw it on the notice board.
Yeah.
I often think about organisations like Bunnings and Coles and so forth that must employ thousands of students.
Yeah.
Yet how do they retain that talent? And how much of it walks out the door and ends up working somewhere else post-graduation? And I don't know if the notice board still exists. They do in that way, electronics, I'm sure. But
look, having worked in those organisations later on as well, it's always a conversation as to how we can utilise that talent that's there, that wants to grow their career. And, the thing about those organisations is, the Coles, the Woolies, etc. There's lots of places you can go. There's lots of opportunity.
Yeah.
There's lots of things to, they've got money. They're wanting to do interesting things, and so how do you put yourself in some of that opportunity and say yes to opportunity and follow some of those things. So it went from the help desk to writing policies and procedures, and then went to writing policies and procedures for their one of their warehouses. It then went to writing policies and procedures for Kmart, that was based in Coles-Mire in that Taronga building, to then being a project administrator for Coles, then being a project manager for Coles. So that was sort of probably the 7 years. But I actually I think I'd already worked for stores for 6 years, so I actually had long service leave at the age of 25. Which was what was the next step then. So
because it looked like you were there, say, for about 7 years in various roles, which it stood out for me as quite interesting because most apprenticeships are about 7 years.
Right.
Like true apprenticeships.
Yeah.
Certainly historically.
It probably felt like that, right?
So it's what it sounds like. It was a kind of take the theoretical concepts of university. You've left home. We've not gone to Mars, but it's a pretty big distance still from home. Learn to stand on your own 2 feet. You've kind of figured out the workplace, and at 25, you've got long service leave. You're living the dream. So then, because it looked like there was like a 3-year break in your resume. So on your LinkedIn, I was trying to figure this out. Maybe it's timings on the LinkedIn.
Sure.
But what happened after?
So interesting enough, at Coles, I worked with a guy. His name was John Robinson, and so I had the long service leave. At 27, I decided I wanted to go overseas. I'd actually had a relationship, nearly married someone, broken up with them. We bought a house, sold the house, and so I was like, I want to go on an adventure, right? So he was like, you've got this. I had a lot of leave too, because the Australian way was don't take your holidays, and you don't need holidays when you're in your 20s, really, when you're young and energetic. And so I think I had 4.5 months leave, and so he said, "Why don't you take a year off? We'll keep your job open for you, and you can come back in a year's time." But he was actually Irish, and so he was like, "Go travelling, go have a good time," right? And I was like, "Oh, that sounds pretty good." And so that was probably the push I needed too. I still had that security of having a job, but I decided to go travelling overseas and backpacked for 6 or 7 months. Landed in the UK in like 99, year 2000, all the .com kind of, big explosion there. I went, I'd left Australia as a, junior project manager. I really couldn't get work doing that in the UK. So I got some contracts writing policies and procedures again. So this is a bit of a lesson in sometimes you have to take a step back to take a step forward, right? Yeah. I then got some roles in, business analysis type thing. I actually worked for Woolworths in the UK. You know who they are. When they still had the pick and mix. And then got back to that sort of project manager type position, worked for DaimlerChrysler after that.
Yeah, right. So was that in the UK, DaimlerChrysler?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, right, okay.
So they, at the time, had decided to buy back 60-odd dealerships within the M25. So they were all separate dealerships. They created a retail company from scratch, effectively. So, and, I'd worked with someone at Woolworths who then was on that project and then sort of moved there with them. And
Which is often the way, right? You kind of, you end up attaching to other people in careers and you kind of move together, which I think in tech, where it's so project orientated, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Because you know that the project's going to be more successful if you're working with a team you know.
Yeah, yeah.
So I then saw, I think around 2006, you joined Tesco.
Yeah.
So that was still probably Milton Keynes?
It was.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
I love that response, by the way. Anyone from the UK will understand that response.
It was the A building, I think, of Milton Keynes. There was A, I think there was A and C. I don't know whether there was actually a B building, but Milton Keynes.
No one wants to be in the B building, let's be honest.
Oh, actually, was it? No, it was Welwyn Garden City.
Sorry, it was
Welwyn Garden City. No, I did work in Milton Keynes though for Daimler, so but it it was Garden City.
You lived in all the great places in the UK.
And then I worked in another startup in Welwyn as well, so which was actually before that I worked. So that's probably interesting. Before that Tesco, I worked for this startup. What was it? It was called Grey Archer, and it was basically a bunch of guys had got their hands on £20 million. And we're talking the year 2000, right?
Yeah.
So, 40 million Australian dollars, 24 years ago. And they decided to create a B2B e-commerce company from scratch. So I started there when there was about 5 people. They grew that company to a couple of hundred. And the lesson in that organisation is when your sales team doesn't match what your sales team is selling does not match your strategy. And so it was a B2B for the pub trade, and they were trying to get the publicans then to purchase all their beer and their wine and their spirits online with their electricity and their gas and this kind of quite good offering well before its time.
Yeah.
And what they were selling into the publican was you get a free computer.
Yeah.
And so they were taking the computer and then not using it to do any of those things that they were trying to grow the organisation on the back of. So that company actually liquidated as well. So that was a fascinating ride from, and my role there was like a project manager and,
it's a great learning experience though. Even when it's not your head on the block, when a business fails like that, you can understand why.
Yeah.
I heard a quote actually earlier this week, which I'd never heard before, and it said, most startups suffer with indigestion, not starvation.
Yeah, that's right.
I never heard that before. Maybe it's a common term, but I just thought it summed it up pretty well.
Yeah.
There's always a hunger and an appetite and ideas to do things and try things, but the assimilation of those ideas and digesting and making it work.
That's right.
Often is where it falls over.
And then it's that link between, what's actually happening on the ground and that user experience on the ground versus what the strategy is and how you're executing on that strategy to it. What ended up happening is Nomura Bank was one of the investors or the key investor. They actually then decided to pull funding, the rest of the funding. And so it just literally liquidated When we come in one day.
You were a bank behind WeWork as well? Maybe they didn't learn that. So
I did that kind of in the middle of that, and then went to Tesco.
So you went from a startup to probably one of the biggest enterprises in the UK. I think through the 2000s, I think they used to say 1 in every £8 was spent with Tesco, retail pounds. It was an enormous, it still is an enormous entity. But what stood out for me when I was reading your background was that you actually worked for the international arm.
Yeah.
And I was less familiar with their operations that I don't think exist now, but in the US, Malaysia, Malaysia's pretty big. I think like 300 stores. No, Czech
Thailand,
Republic. I was amazed, 300 stores in the Czech Republic. So how was that? I guess what I'm interested in there is what was it like working for the international arm of such a big established mothership?
Oh, it was fun. And so I did start working for the UK business first off in some of their point of sale stuff. And I think we were at Cheshunt then. We were actually in their building, you know, the one of their data centers. And so one side it was like a you know, chicken run type hatch, you know, all the data center on one side, and you know, us a whole bunch of workers, you know, in lines on the other side. So I started with the UK first, and then everyone in the UK business said, you don't want to go to international because you've got to work too hard. So, but I mean, that sounded fantastic for me, right? So prior to that, though, with the UK business, I actually went and spent 4 months in India. So at that point, they were developing their offshore model in India, so all their accounts payable and everything like that had gone there. They were developing all that tech space, and so they were a bit like, none of the Brits wanted to go to India at that time, and so they're like, let's send the Australians, she'll go. And so, which was great because I was actually contracting, so that whole time in the UK I contracted, and so I actually just put up my day rate went to India. Was on a per diem, didn't spend any money, saved a bunch of cash, was there for 4 months. I'd actually gotten married about a year before, so I insisted I had to come back for my first wedding anniversary. But you know, that was great. And then I went so being in that role in India, a lot of people from head office would come out. I used to joke and call it Western a week because a whole bunch of people from the UK office would turn up for the week and then leave again. And some people would just get sick on the first day and you wouldn't see them for the rest of the week. So, but you got to meet a lot of the senior executives through that. And so that then got me the role in the international business contracting because I met someone. And so then I was in the international business and got to travel. So Tesco at the time were creating their Tesco operating model, which was a standard way of how they were going to operate stores globally. So a standard set of instructions to operate their business. So it actually wasn't just stores, it was a whole business. And so they developed this operating model, which they were then rolling out. I looked after the warehouse management part of that from a systems perspective. And then they were landing that in different areas. Their model at the time was as well as they'd buy an established business, run it for a while, and then start to implement some of their own things. So they very much did that successfully in Thailand. They did that very successfully in Turkey. So I spent quite a lot of time in Turkey. They were actually, my stream was a bit different because we were actually building warehouses and we needed systems in some of those countries. They then at that time went into the US as well with that Fresh and Easy, which didn't end up being so successful for them. It was the only spot that they didn't actually buy something established and run it.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, and you know, this is another lesson for people listening, right, is that I actually got myself a permanent job, not a permanent job, but I actually got a contract out in the US. Again, traveling. I met one of the guys running the US business from an IT perspective. He asked me to go and be on his team. And which again was going to be an uplift in my contract rate again, right? And again, you know, be funded, etc., which was appealing at the time. But then, and also by that time, I'd been in the UK for 8 years, right? So bit of personal information. I mentioned I was married. I actually met my husband traveling. He's from Australia, so we met traveling. So we both had a love of travel. We'd decided the year had obviously well passed, right? And, so I wasn't coming back to Coles, unfortunately. And, just developed a career and developed my life over there. And then, probably had kind of come to the end of that, done too many winters maybe. Because I think I remember my first winter, my first summer, I was waiting for summer. And then I realised the summer had actually come and gone, and I didn't notice that it was summer, right? So I just probably had got to, the end of maybe being in the UK. And because life is a little bit, having grown up in Australia, it is a little bit harder. It's busier. It's, it's fun and it's exciting, and you've got lots of opportunities to travel. And we'd done a lot of that. And so I had this opportunity to then go to the US, said yes, and then found out I was actually pregnant with my now oldest son, who's just turned, or is turning, just about to turn 17. So that was very much a sliding doors moment. So instead of going to live in LA and work on that project for a year, I ended up staying in the UK, and then we ended up coming back to Australia off the back of that. So
what a terrible burden for your son to know he destroyed your dreams.
Not so much,
So I was going to ask how you come back to Melbourne, and I did smile when I saw that you came back to Woolworths. I thought you're just obsessed with bloody supermarkets at this point in your career. But you spent, I think, then 5 years with Woolworths here.
Yeah.
And sort of three different roles, I think, through that time from what I could kind of take in. But so what was happening in that time, and how was your career kind of shaping and evolving?
So came back, had my son, his name's Reese, and was in Melbourne. And at the time, I think Wesfarmers had just actually bought Coles, and so I had the desire when I come back to work for one of the two big players, to work for Coles or to work for Woolworths. That was the aim. And so I went into Coles, and at the time I had a 5-month-old baby at home. And I did mention that. And it might have been part of their decision, maybe not to bring me on board. I'll never know. But I remember I was still breastfeeding when I went for the interviews. I was trying to time the interviews and all the rest of it. Anyway, and so they ended up turning around and saying, we can't bring anyone external in at this time. So it was going to be a senior role running their merchandise systems for them, which was not so much my background, but I'd kind of done, everything else. I'd done everything either side of all of that. And merch is huge from a systems for retail's perspective. So it would have been a good challenge. And then so in that time, I remember waking up in the middle of the night and crying because I didn't get that job. And my husband waking up going, what is wrong? And I was crying because that was like the plan, right? What ended up happening was someone from Woolworths went to the States, went and visited Tesco. Someone in Tesco said to the guy who'd come from Woolworths, I know someone who's just gone back to Australia. You should look her up. Wow. So that bloke did look me up. And, I ended up going and working for Woolworths instead. So we'd only been back in Australia. We'd probably been back in Australia for a year. We were in Melbourne, and then within a month we relocated with an 8-month-old to Woolworths in Sydney. So to a big job. So I was running a $16 million budget for them for their stores, for all their IT projects across all of their brands. So excuse me.
Did you have family, friends, and so forth in Sydney?
No, we had some friends, right? Yeah. But we were also just new parents, so we had an 8-month-old when we went there, and so
that's incredibly tough.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
So, and it was really interesting too, right? Because I come from the UK, and I think in the UK you share a little bit less about yourself maybe in the workplace. You're a little bit more reserved, I think, as a culture.
That's right. I'll go with your casual racism. That's okay. Go on.
No. But I think you just, you tend to hold...
I agree with you. Yeah. It's more... I'd say the UK is more... maybe a bit more transactional,
Yes.
as in you come in, you do your job,
Yeah.
you know your colleagues. Whereas I found Australia's much more relational. People
Yes.
want to get to know a bit more
Yeah.
about you and your story.
People ask you a lot more questions than, say, what people would ask you in the UK. So I was very used to that way of operating. I then go into, a big workplace, Woolworths, in a senior role with a big team. I had like 40 project managers, 4 or 5 program managers reporting into me, $60 million worth of projects, 100 projects we were running, and I had an 8-month-old. I just remember keeping that quite personal at the time because I didn't want someone to judge me or so it was always very much, and like I said, this is 17 years ago, right? I didn't want anyone to judge what I was capable for or not tap me on the shoulder for something because they thought I had a young child at home. And so it wasn't like, if people asked me if I had a child, I would say yes, right? But I didn't have a picture of him on my desk. I didn't openly kind of I was very work focused.
Just very conscious to not have a picture on your desk or
and those were the days when you had pictures of your cats and stuff on your desk.
Your desk was your domain, right? And
that's
you
right.
kind of you owned it and personalised
had nothing.
it. Yeah, wow, okay.
And it was, look, I would say too, it was quite the adjustment going from a big role in, I went to Woolworths too because I thought it was quite exciting, and I'd come back to Melbourne, had a baby, he was amazing, but I was at home and I was a bit bored, really. Yeah. In the nicest possible way. Yeah. Because I'd gone from like an international career for a large organisation delivering things at pace. Like we were at Tesco, we were rolling out multiple countries at the one time. I was running, putting warehouse solutions into Turkey, into China, into Hungary, into the US consecutively, right? Yeah. With a team of people in those places, with different stakeholders. We had, everyone, it's so funny, I think now, everyone's like, flexible working and, working from home and all the rest of it. We were working from all parts of the world, right? I knew at that point who was delivering and who wasn't. So I'd gone from that to being at home with a newborn in Melbourne to then going, and which I loved, right? Don't get me wrong. But it really wasn't a consideration at the time that I would go back to my work and my husband would stay home. Like it just wasn't a conversation. It wasn't that time. That was quite unusual. And we didn't even think of having that conversation as well. So then when I got called up by Woolworths, I was like, let's go.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Did you, because you were with Woolworths, I think 5 years. Yeah. That whole time was in Sydney?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Oh, well, actually, no. I did that role for a while. I then got promoted into heading up technology for the liquor division. They kind of restructured. So I actually got promoted, ended up reporting into Dan Beecham at the time. We were running IT for all of the brands for Woolworths. He had a team of 18 direct reports. There was 3 women on that team, so 15 men, 3 women. I was still in my 30s.
Yeah.
I then had my second child in Sydney. So I did that role running IT for liquor, which was the liquor brand in stores. It was Dan Murphy's, even though there was some technology in there as in Dan Murphy's as well, and it was BWS. And then I moved to fuel. Some of the big things that were happening at the time was all the self-checkouts in those stores. We were consolidating all the point of sale across all of those different brands. Woolworths was building some of their own data centres. I ran the first online e-commerce project for Woolworths as well. So that was all happening. So it was pretty exciting times, lots of interesting stuff. I then had my second son and he and then I remember going into obviously the family were all actually in Melbourne, and so after we had him, my husband was working for a real estate Mentorship.com at the time, which was also doing incredible things. He'd gotten a role with them when we come back from the UK. He was able to relocate with them to Sydney as well. They were great. We then decided we'd come down here, and we were like, what are we doing in Sydney with 2 kids? You know, the adventure had worn off a little bit by that point. And we decided to return to Melbourne. And so I went into Dan, and so this describes who I am as well as a person. We had also bought a house and renovated it as well as, so not only was I running, like, I look back now and think, what was wrong with me? I had a toddler, took a big role, got a bigger role, bought a house, renovated that house. We had another place in Melbourne, decided to renovate that as well, a unit as well. So I was doing all of those things. And then I went into Dan and said, look, we've actually sold our house. We've decided to go back to Melbourne. Now, he was great. Woolworths had at the time purchased a business called Danks. They had also gone into the hardware sector as well with the business starts with M. Doesn't exist anymore.
Okay, I'm not going to be able to help you there with that.
They were like a big box hardware store. Yeah. They'd done a partnership with Lowe's, and so Danks was actually based in Melbourne. So I then was able to pick up a role as a program type. It was actually a business role. I was running some programs for them around consolidating. They had about 40 odd other hardware stores in Tasmania, and they actually bought a mill and all sorts of different stuff, right? So again, very, startup-ish and very kind of, So I was, 2 kids, renovating another house as well, decided to do that as well. Again, quite crazy, right?
So at what point then, because obviously when you left Woolworths, you then went to Simplot as CIO.
Yeah.
So obviously you were a bit bored and needed again. How did you know you were ready for a CIO role?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'd headed up IT for liquor and fuel, right? And so that was very much a quasi-CIO for those businesses. So that sat on the management teams for those businesses, dual reporting into Dan, who was CIO at Woolworths, and then into the business leader of those businesses, right? So very much that exec team type situation. And so when I'd come down to Melbourne, been working in Danks for quite a while, probably 12 months, I realised that my career with Woolworths was Sydney at the time. Whether they are today or not, I'm not sure, but kind of my opportunities were limited by being in Melbourne working for that business. It probably would be different these days. And so therefore decided that I wanted to explore. By then it was funny. I went to an interview as like a program manager role with that organisation, and they said to me in the interview, our CIO is retiring. Would you be interested in the job? And of course I said yes. So I went in on the proviso that he was retiring and that I would step into that role. It wasn't a given. Those things never are, but that was the idea.
Okay, so there was a kind of transition period. Okay. So
it ended up only being a couple of months. So
okay. Right. So it wasn't like a succession plan as such. It was more of a kind of hand over the guard, so to speak, right. Change of the guard. Yeah. At that point, I guess, as you were kind of moving into leadership roles, who were your kind of role models?
Yeah, look, I mean, at Woolworths, I'd worked with, so I'd always, throughout my whole career, had actually established great relationships with women who were probably maybe 10 years ahead of me, right? And had close relationships with them. So even back in the Target days, there was a woman that I worked with, her name was Judy Mundy. When I was at Coles, there was a woman named Ruth Yates. When I was at the startup in the UK, there was a lady named Karen Brown. And then, when I was at Woolies, there was a lady named Jackie McKeating, who I had established close relationships. I'd go walking with them at lunchtime or something like that.
Yeah, okay.
I'd have coffees with them. So if I look back, it wasn't something that I set out to do. It wasn't like, I'm going to find myself a mentor. It was women that I got along with who ended up becoming a mentor, and that relation, that's how that sort of went. Yeah.
Yes, interesting. Again, that kind of unconscious understanding that these are people where I probably want to be in the next decade. So let's hang out with them. Let's learn from them. Let's absorb.
I don't even know if I thought about it that much. Right?
Yeah, okay.
It was more, probably I could see they were good at what they did, and I would use them as a bit of a, sounding board, so to speak, and had a good relationship with all of them, and just would regularly catch up and stuff like that. So
yeah, great. After Simplot, you had a kind of series of CIO roles. There was L'Oreal, there was Suzanne Group. And also what I love is GM of Tech at Target. A kind of full circle moment. Which is awesome. I guess what were you achieving through those roles, and how was that kind of continuing to shape you as a leader?
Yeah, look, I think Simplot was like my first standalone CIO gig. Probably what I missed in that is that broader network. I'd come from those big places that, that, like I said, 18 colleagues or whatever, right? And so it actually was a little bit lonely in some of those roles, and probably something I think I should have done a bit better at that time was actually network a bit more. I was raising toddlers though, right?
Yeah,
so,
right.
I went into Simplot and I think I had a 2-year-old at home and a 5-year-old. So I was, doing the run to childcare and the run to school, or some of those things. When I returned to Melbourne, I couldn't actually get childcare, so I did have a nanny for a period of time, very expensive. But I had the kids looked after, right? Because in those big jobs, they're very demanding. So I think I was just trying to get through the day, really. And we did a lot of great work in those organisations. All that sort of digital transformation. That was all of that kind of time, etc. So I think L'Oreal, we put up 5 digital sites. Simplot, I remember saving a bunch of money in that organisation. They'd sort of it was really kind of like a transformation. We implemented Agile. All of that Agile stuff was kicking off in the industry at the time. So I went along to a few conferences, and then we thought, let's start by kicking off one Agile project. We delivered a piece of work in 12 weeks, which had been sort of unheard of in the organisation previously. And so that sort of ran rife in that organisation, which was great. They had that background of lean manufacturing, etc. So that was good. What I really loved during that time was actually developing people. And so developing my own teams, I really got to do that in those roles. And I had some people that actually, followed me through some of those organisations as well. And from that time, 4 of the people that reported into me are now CIOs themselves. So I'm actually, really proud of that and have been able to have an impact in their careers. So
yeah, that's really interesting. I think ordinarily I spend way more time talking about people's backgrounds and the early days in their podcast. But I think what really stood out for me when I was kind of preparing for today is I'm really interested in what you've been up to since 2019. And even just in the conversations we've talked through in the last sort of half an hour or so, there's been a snippet of your experiences as a young mum. In the workplace. There's the development of people there that have gone on to become CIOs, for example. And in 2019, your career kind of exploded in a multitude of different directions. In fact, career is not probably the right word for it, but let's say the working aspect of your life exploded. Thank you for listening to Tales from Tech Titans, and be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcast. If you'd like to get more insights about tech careers, then check out the Ember, that's EMMBR LinkedIn page for the latest updates, articles, and engaging discussions.